Hi everyone, EG here. So I'm going to continue the topic of estrangements today with talking about why estrangements are on the rise. Why are they increasing? And there are some people that would dispute this and say, oh, they're not really increasing, just people didn't talk about it before. But no, most people agree they are increasing. More and more people are becoming estranged from family members. And while it wasn't unheard of 20, 50 years ago even, it's certainly on the increase. Statistics say that 1 in 4 people are estranged from some family member. And so that's 25% right there that are estranged from someone in their family. Now, there hasn't been a lot of studies on this yet because this isn't, this is something that's been increasing probably in the last 20 years or more, but they haven't really been able to do like longitudinal studies to really figure out what the dynamic is. I think that's really needed because I think this is going to just increase with time. The generation of young people now that are not speaking to parents, they're setting an example for their own children, and so the likelihood that their own kids will stop speaking to them at some point increases, and it just becomes exponential at that point. It's just going to continue on through the generations. So, and I think that's the concern. So I think the big question about it is this something that was needed? In other words, did we need to shine more light on, particularly, let's talk about parental abuse than we have in the past? Is that something that was just hidden and not talked about, and people kept talking to their parents even though they were abused? Is this, in fact, a worrisome development that really showcases a problem within our culture? In other words, within at least the culture of the United States. It may occur more in other Western cultures as well. And so is this, a sign that the family is really in trouble at this point? So let's talk a little bit about it. As you know, my background is I'm estranged from my only son. I only have one child, and not through any desire of my own to be estranged from him. I never have received an explanation for him as to why he decided to be estranged. But as I've shared before, he did this to my mother, which was his grandmother, before he ever did it to me. Like, he wasn't speaking to her for almost 10 years by the time that he then turned that on me. So he has a history of doing that. And I know his grandmother, I know my mother did not abuse him in any way. So, and in my case, if you've seen my video, which I did 2.5 years ago, on the fact, I think it's that I haven't spoken to my son in 12 years or something was the title of that. And I own a lot of the mistakes I made with my son. I own my part in it, but I do think that there are critics out there who will say, well, the thing is now people are more open to talk about the abuse they're getting and this and that. And I agree. In cases where there's extreme abuse, whether it's sexual, physical, or even in some cases emotional abuse that's extreme, I agree. Probably wasn't talked about enough, and now it is. So I do think that some cases of estrangement are warranted, and probably it's for the good of, in most cases, it's the child, although sometimes it's the parent. The parents also have had to estrange themselves from their kids who are, for instance, addicted or exhibiting very problematic behaviors and things like that. So I know it can go both ways. It's not just children estranged from parents, but it's also parents estranged from children. There has been increased awareness of estrangement in the last 20, 30 years. And there has been increased awareness of the abuse that may lead to estrangement. And people would argue that, estrangement is just setting firm boundaries. If you go little contact or no contact or whatever, route you go, that it's necessary to preserve, one's own sanity. And I'm not going to really argue with that. I think the extent of abuse is all in the eye of the beholder. But I do think that social media today has led to a prominent increase in estrangements, and support groups on Instagram and Reddit and things like that really kind of encourage people to not speak to their parents, or in some cases maybe parents not speak to their kids, to an extreme where there may not be serious abuse involved. It may just be, I will share this, and I've shared this before. When my son stopped speaking to my mother, his grandmother, years before he stopped speaking to me, and I took that as a really danger sign for myself. I really believed that I was going to be next, and I was. But when he did stop speaking to her, he told me his reasons was that he just didn't like talking to her, and he didn't like the way she treated me. That is what he said. Now, I don't find that a strong reason to just go no contact with somebody. She had not done anything to him harmful. So in speaking for my mother now, who's long passed away now for 11 years, but I would say I don't believe that was a good reason to do that. Now, I'm not going to argue about, my son's reasons for not speaking to me, because as I said, I own my part in some of that. So I'm not going to get into the nitpicking about that issue. But I will say, I do think that it was extreme for him to do that to his grandmother. So that worries me. If that's a sign that young people today are doing that just because, I don't like talking to that family member, or I don't like their personality, I don't think that's a strong reason to go no contact. Now, you may have lesser contact, and that's fine. I would understand that. People don't want to be around somebody a lot that they just don't enjoy. Basically go no contact, as in the case of my son with his grandmother. I still don't understand it. I know what he told me. I don't really understand it. And I know it broke my mother's heart. She never really understood why he was doing that. Anyway, back to the basic idea of, while there is a need probably for more openness about things, abuse that would cause estrangement, and while there are probably many cases in which estrangement is warranted, I do think it's definitely over-practiced today. There's definitely far more estrangement than probably is called for. So let's talk about some specific reasons for that. And I'm going to refer to basically a psychologist named Joshua Coleman, who's written a book called The Rules of Estrangement. I have not read it yet. I read an article, though, an interview with him, so I got a lot of information from that. He gave an interview on NPR. And he basically said he was troubled by estrangement becoming almost too acceptable now. In other words, it was too acceptable for people just to say, I don't want to deal with that person in my family anymore, so I'm just not going to talk to them ever again. And that was becoming, as part of it was becoming this support network through social media that encourages stuff like that. And he said that was worrying to him, that was kind of feeding this idea that just because you don't like somebody in your family means you never have to speak to them again. And he actually called it, Dr. Coleman called it a social contagion that's happening around this issue. Because he said this kind of weeding out of somebody in your family that you view as toxic, and toxic is a very subjective term. What is one person's toxic is not another person's toxic. So what you might regard as someone who's toxic may not truly be that. There's a lot of bandying about of terms like toxic and narcissist way too often nowadays. I mean, if we were going to go by what most people say out there in social media, we would say, well, everybody apparently is toxic and everybody is a narcissist, because that's the kind of thing I even hear through comments, even on my own channel when I do videos like this, where people talk about, this person in my life was a narcissist and this other person was a narcissist. And honestly, true narcissists are not as plentiful as people somehow seem to claim. Someone with a diagnosed disorder such as narcissistic personality disorder, that is not a dominant disorder in our society, even in our highly individualistic society. It is not a dominant thing. So I think people are using the terms very loosely, and what they're doing is they're basically saying, well, instead of avoiding this person because they might represent real harm to me, which in that case, yes, it's probably good to stay away from them. They're just doing it because they just don't like their personality, or they believe they're toxic, even if there's nothing specific or concrete to go by. And that's what Dr. Coleman is talking about, is that what's worrying is we're seeing that trend. When you're weeding out people just because you think they're toxic, what does that mean? What does toxic mean to you? That's the question. And I think to every person it means something different. So people are just using that as their rationale when it's not really based on anything concrete or measurable. Now, if you have a family member who really does have mental illness and has a diagnosable illness such as schizophrenia, we'll say, then you could say, well, I don't want to be around that family member. I know they have schizophrenia and it makes me uncomfortable. Well, that's more understandable because this person really does have a disorder and maybe you just can't handle it. So that makes sense. But Dr. Coleman is talking about how what is scary about all this and the rise in this estrangement is that we're not focusing on the concepts of connectedness with people or interdependence with other people, which is what the basis of the family was really about for, centuries. So instead, we're just throwing that, we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I guess, and we're losing that. So as I said earlier in the video, what is scary is how is this going to affect the next generation and then the next generation? And so forth. Will the pendulum swing back the other way, and will it course correct culturally? Hopefully it will. And, while I encourage people to, estrange as needed to protect your own, especially physical safety from someone, I think this has really gone too far. And I do believe, and I'm not saying this just because it has affected me personally. I knew about this even before my estrangement with my son. I knew about the concept. I have a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I've known about this since the late 90s. But the thing is that it always was kind of concerning even then because there was some talk about how this was occurring even 20, 25 years ago than it had been in the past. So, while there are many causes of estrangement, I would say probably the most common things today are still divorce. Divorce has always been a common reason for a child being estranged from one parent or the other. There also is, of course, real childhood abuse and neglect going on that would also cause estrangement. I think that what constitutes childhood abuse and neglect, our definitions of that have changed. And Dr. Coleman talks about this as well, that what's concerning is what used to be considered, like real abuse. Your parent, even if it's emotional abuse, they're telling you you're not good enough, or they're telling you you're a loser, or they're telling you that certainly would be abusive. But it's now become someone saying, well, I don't like the way they talk to me in general. I just don't like their sound of their voice, or I don't like what they talk about, like referring back to what my son said about his grandmother, that I just don't like what they talk about. Okay, how is that abuse? Now, you may not like it, but I would, put forward that that's probably not abuse. So I think our definitions of what constitutes abuse have changed, become very subjective. And of course, again, as Dr. Coleman pointed out, this is really fed by the social media environment and people who join groups on TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, and other platforms where they're just encouraged. Oh, if you don't like your parents, then just don't speak to them. Or if you don't like your grandparents, just don't speak to them. I think that this has caused so much pain and so much heartache. And I get, messages from viewers all the time that are going through estrangement. It's really heartbreaking to read their stories. I would say to the parents out there in particular, because me being a parent who is, going through this, that I unfortunately don't expect anything to change anytime soon. And I mean in general with the culture of estrangement. While it is true, and Dr. Coleman talks about this, that the majority of people do eventually talk to their family member that they've been estranged from, not all do. And I think the number of people that are not reconnecting with their family is also increasing. That's just my personal take on it. But I would say to you parents out there, first of all, I understand your pain. I feel it. I feel that kind of pain all the time. And I know that in my case, I will likely never reconnect with my son. It's just not in his nature to go back on something when he does that. So I don't expect that ever to change. I would say that the culture has changed. And if you're looking for, a quick turnaround on this, it's probably us that are parents and grandparents. It may not happen in our lifetimes, but hopefully in the generations to come, in the future, this phenomenon will course correct, and people will realize the value of family, and that unless it's a case of real abuse going on, that it is important to have family connectedness and family support, and the kind of benefits that you get from having a family unit. So that's my take on this about why I think estrangements are on the rise, and because I think this is a really important issue, and I think a lot of you viewers out there think it's an important issue. So we're going to continue to talk about it. And until next time, take care of yourselves and keep moving forward. Bye.